Normal, for my daughters Micah, Sophia, and Rory Sarah. I'm fighting normal. I'm choreographing this other dance where you spin across the floor and out the door while the other kids are still jumping on the spot, popping up to learn ballet. From an outsider's eye, you might call ours the Dancing Raccoon Disco, or perhaps we are the Hip-Hop Squirrel Brigade, the slippery salmon lover of clouds, or we are the bears who hold up signs saying, "We'll work for honey and funk." Find your totem. There's no tradition I will hold you to. What I'm saying is that I want you to keep moving, and I don't care if it is in your body or your mind. When the other kids pirouette, you are already gone. You've sold your tutu and moved to Amsterdam. You've awoken on a beach in Vanuatu, and when the person you love says, "I love you," you have the confidence to say, "I love me too," and that's why I can love you back ferociously in the language of red. It's simple, really. I want to give you both the gift of yes. The door is open, and even though we're supposed to stay, we are spinning across the floor in violation of expectation and structure. What I'm saying is, go barefoot or walk out with a handstand. Live in possibility and in constant proximity to desire. Don't just dream, burn your dreams. Heat your life with that fire. Thanks. And I'm just going to end with this poem, a little longer one. Science fiction. In writing school, we were all so in love with ourselves that we wanted to be someone else, someone good enough to reflect our egos back to us in pleasing ways. We had a Gwendolyn McEwen type who had windswept eyes and a penchant for rowboats that she would fill with candles and used to sail out of the classroom and down the street in a funeral procession led by her own mother's hate. We had a Paul Thoreau who would never shut up. I suppose at the time I wanted to be Raymond Carver. But of all my classmates, the person I remember clearest was the one everyone respected the least, the small, awkward student who wrote science fiction. He was perhaps the most passionate person in the class, but his passion for science fiction made him even more absurd to a group of young people already dreaming about the composition of their literary obituaries. To introduce a story, he said, "What you need to know is that there are 3 moons that revolve around the planet of Andar." And then he was gone into the science of his plot, the effects of gravitational pull on character development, the available ballistics, how they'd have guns but preferred to fight with sabers, and his hero who shall, by the end of his story, slaughter the orc-like villains and send them back to a life buried in clay. His work was widely dismissed. He was given suggested readings, serious books by serious authors. He came back to the next class with a poem he'd written about karate. He stood up, took off his coat, and from his bag he unfolded and then put on a white karate jacket, which in all honesty made him look even smaller. He squared his feet back, braced his body in battle position, and shouted his poem while punching the air. He may even have had good style, but the sight of this tiny science fiction writer dressed for karate and punching his poem into being was simply too much for our group to handle. When those of us who were trying to hold back their laughter simply could not anymore, it blew out of our chests uncontrollably until everyone was openly laughing. He simply stopped, picked up his jacket, walked out of the room, and never came back. Officially, we were told he had dropped the course to find something that was a better fit. Unofficially, we talked about the moons of Andar, his karate position, and whether or not he was the kind of person who would come to our class and shoot everyone. At that time, in our early 20s, we just couldn't see past our own self-delusion. But in thinking about him now, I understand he was just a young man who desperately wanted to make himself stronger. We were all so wrong about science fiction. 3 times in my life, in very real ways, I have felt the knowledge that I have superpowers. You see, one day I became a supervillain, and I had the power to shoot beams of energy from my chest. I've also glimpsed portholes, and occasionally I can see through them. Lastly, when certain elements line up with my body, I gain the perception of perpetual speed, and I do indeed become the Flash, the fastest man in the world. On April 17, 2007, at approximately 5:14 p.m. in front of my house, my daughter, age 5, waved at a friend from the sidewalk, and when she stepped off the curb and ran to go see him, a speeding SUV struck her and knocked her down the street. I saw the impact from our living room window. I may have flown off the front of my steps. I may have teleported to her. I can't be sure how I got there, but when I picked her up, blood trickled out of her mouth, and I went into shock. As it turns out, the blood from her mouth was not internal bleeding, but ran from a deep cut where she had bitten through her tongue. 3 ambulances and 2 fire trucks came. She had muscle pain and road rash up one side of her body, but otherwise was fine. Jillian held her, and I went outside where the driver of the SUV was in our front yard with her camera. She was taking pictures of the street and her vehicle. She kept repeating to my neighbor that she wasn't going to have to pay. This is when I became the supervillain. As clearly as I have the power to walk, I could feel the hate in my chest coagulating into a ball of energy that I was sure I could shoot from my chest to vaporize her. I could feel the power to kill her through the strength of my hate. I charged at her and my neighbor intervened. I thought about releasing a beam of hate and vaporizing them both, but instead I told her to leave my neighborhood or I'd kill her with my bare hands. My neighbor insisted that she stayed until she talked to the police, and I went back inside to get Jillian, because I was certain Jillian would want me to kill her too. But instead, she told me to calm down. I couldn't understand her. A police officer came in to check on Rory and question us. Jillian started by apologizing for me and telling the officer I was just upset. She told him about the woman taking pictures. The police officer said he would have been equally angry, but we should keep in mind the driver of the vehicle was in shock. I said yes, I was sorry, that I got caught up in the heat of the moment. I was just worried about my daughter. But really, I was lying to them, and I wanted them to believe me, so I could leave and follow the woman home, because even then, I still wanted to kill her. Jillian began to cook. I usually do the cooking in the house, but in this moment she began to cook and cook and cook. She could not stop cooking. Her mood was jovial, which frustrated me, because I wanted to convince her that we should burn the world. She invited the police to stay. She would make pineapple and red pepper shish kebabs with a teriyaki glaze, garlic mashed potatoes, and all of Rory's favorite food. There would be enough for the ambulance drivers and all the neighbors. Really, they should all stay. It was as if the accident had cheered her up. It wasn't until 3 months later that her hair began to fall out. At first we noticed just a little, but then it became clear that her beautiful hair was falling out in large clumps. We took her to the walk-in clinic, and the doctor asked her if she had suffered a trauma within the past few months, and she told him, 3 months ago, if only for a moment, we thought we were going to lose our daughter. That fall, Jillian and I finished collecting oral histories for a book called Hope and Shadows. We would take turns going to the downtown east side to interview disadvantaged people about their lives. We alternated so neither would have to take the full emotional burden of hearing stories of abuse that are so common in an impoverished neighborhood. Sometimes the stories would inspire us, but often they would open us up to a narrative we weren't always prepared to hear. One day I listened to the story of a woman I assumed was about 40 years old. She had started working as a prostitute at the age of 13. She was in a wheelchair because someone had thrown her down the escalator at the Granville SkyTrain, and one of the striped metal steps crushed her vertebrae. Recently, she'd been panhandling outside the Roxy nightclub, and some men came out of the bar and threw her out of her wheelchair for a joke. I asked her age, and found out she was actually 24 years old. When I got home, I had 2 goals: to keep calm in front of my kids and drink as much wine as possible. I must have poured half a bottle into my first glass. I prepared myself to put up with my kids' misbehavior. I would do everything I could to hold it together. But Rory could tell something was wrong, and she hugged my legs and said, "Daddy, you're the best daddy in the world." And this is what set me off, bawling like a child in front of my own children. Sometime that fall, my friend Ian introduced us to the music of Jonathan Richman. I wasn't familiar with Richman's music, but Ian had 2 tickets to see him, and he assured me we'd love his show, so we went. I now own many of his albums, but it's Richman's rock and romance that became an important part of our lives. This album is a sonata to happiness. It is sunshine and beach sand. It is a healing condition told through the quest for a new pair of jeans. On days we had hard interviews, it was our cure, our cleanser, to go for a run and listen to rock and romance. 3 years later, the book was going into a second printing and I was at my publisher's. He said he had forgotten to tell me, but we'd received a letter. It was a letter from Jonathan Richman. He wanted us to know that he had been in town performing and a homeless person had sold him a copy of Hope and Shadows. He was writing to say how much he enjoyed it. This was more important than just receiving a note from someone we admired. It was a convergence. I couldn't have been on my bicycle fast enough. I was pedaling as quickly as I could. I had to get home to show Jillian this letter from Jonathan Richman. I was biking down Abbott toward BC Place and the road was blocked. People were standing around. There was a baby stroller in the street under a yellow tarp. I asked someone what had happened and was told a mother was waiting at the light to cross the street, and when she stepped off the curb, a tow truck hit and killed her baby. Panic set in. Again, I couldn't get home fast enough. I needed to get home as quick as possible. Every molecule of my body was water. It was as if I could slip into the ocean. This is how it happens. A mother's life changes forever one afternoon. Where could that mother place herself after such a horrible loss? Sometimes all we have is fantasy. Sometimes we need science fiction. Throughout the city you can see memorials built for people who have been killed by motorists. Each memorial has its own distinct energy. The memorials with the strongest pull are the 2 I've seen in the city that were erected for children. One is framed around a teddy bear tied to a pole with purple ribbon. The other is a perpetually refreshed stack of flowers